Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here with us today. We are very pleased to feature Dr. Steve Souza, owner of Clean Waters Consulting, who will be presenting as part of our NEMO Stormwater Seminar Series. This morning, he will be talking about floating wetland islands. So without further ado, Dr. Souza, thank you for being here.
Yes, and thanks for having me. What we'll be going through today is the application of floating wetland islands, which are artificial wetlands that are being used in a lot of different applications for the removal of nutrients as well as the filtering of sediment. And some of these applications have actually been, used in settings like for the polishing of wastewater, so water that's exiting sewage treatment plants, or for helping to clean up acid mine drainage. But we'll be talking about this as perhaps as a tool to remove nitrogen and phosphorus from stormwater runoff prior to that runoff entering Barnegat Bay. So we all know that, Barnegat Bay is subject to eutrophication because of the influx of nitrogen. And although some of that nitrogen enters from atmospheric deposition or from groundwater, which is somewhat difficult to manage, we can do a pretty good job at addressing the nitrogen that's entering the bay from stormwater runoff or surface water discharges. So a lot of this nitrogen enters the bay either as a result of runoff that's been stored for a given amount of time in various stormwater ponds, which are pretty common within the Barnegat Bay watershed, or perhaps stormwater runoff that is entering streams. And both of those situations provide an opportunity for the further removal of nitrogen as well as phosphorus from those potential sources. So floating wetland islands, as I mentioned, they're basically artificial wetlands. And basically what they are intended to do is try to replicate the nutrient and sediment removal that you get with natural wetlands. In addition, they can provide some habitat for fish, and then as we'll see, maybe protect shorelines from erosion. And they can be planted with a variety of different species, so they can even provide some type of aesthetic benefit to a community. So within the Barnegat Bay watershed, some of the possible uses, as I noted, they could be introduced and utilized in natural lakes and ponds. I'll show you some examples of that. Stormwater retention basins, which I noted are pretty common throughout the watershed. Agricultural ponds, these would be ponds that provide stormwater management for agricultural facilities that could include feedlots, and then some slow-moving drainage ways, and maybe even at the mouth of some slow-moving tributaries, and perhaps even within the bay itself. So floating wetland islands, this is nothing new. These applications go back really to the late 1990s and being used as a means of stormwater management. But there are some more recent applications, particularly down in Florida, where there has been continued interest in removing nitrogen from surface waters because of impacts to like say Tampa Bay and some of the other estuarine areas that are suffering harmful algae blooms and other types of water quality impairments. And in this particular study that was published by Vasquez and Burney in 2015, they did find that these floating wetland islands were capable of removing about 4.2 kilograms of nitrogen per meter squared of floating wetland islands. Now, they may not sound like a lot when you're talking about roughly about 10 pounds of nitrogen per year, but that probably could be enough to really reduce the amount of algae by that one particular floating island by as much as around 1,000 to maybe even 2,000 pounds of algae. So it's a pretty significant way of decreasing nutrients, and that has actually a beneficial positive impact on water quality. Same thing holds true for phosphorus removal. We have a lot more local examples of this. There's a couple of floating wetland island examples in the Deal Lake watershed area, and also they've been used extensively at Duke's Farm up in Hillsborough, New Jersey. And those systems have been shown to be able to remove somewhere in the vicinity, again, of about 10 pounds of phosphorus per year per island. And again, that equates to on the order of about, for every pound of phosphorus removed, about 1,000 pounds of algae that would not be able to really become present in those treated water bodies. So let's look a little bit closer at floating wetland islands, and basically all of these different types of floating wetland islands that you can obtain through different types of different vendors use some type of synthetic base. Some of those bases are made from recycled plastic bottles, for instance. But the base essentially has some type of flotation device associated with it. So it sits on the top of the water, and then it's planted with vegetation. And basically the roots of that vegetation pokes down through the base, and through somewhat of a process that's similar to hydroponic gardening, the plants extract nutrients from the water that they're sitting over. In addition to that, the mats themselves, those planting beds, provide habitat for a whole host of different types of microbiota that also work in concert with the plants to assimilate nutrients from the water. So this is a concept. This is from one of the major manufacturers, Floating Islands International, but just gives you a sense of as water enters the system, it's treated by these plants, and then as it exits the system, it has a lower amount of either nutrients or sediment. And as I mentioned, a lot of this is a result of the direct extraction of nutrients from the water by the plants, or just the physical filtering of that water by the plant roots. But there's also a whole ton of additional benefit that comes about both through filtration and assimilation of nutrients by the microbes and variety of other types of organisms that are living on and within the roots of the plants or on the bottom of the mat. So there, as I said, there are a variety of different manufacturers out there. These are three of the most prominent manufacturers, and I've provided for you links to each one of those companies. As you can see, they all sort of look somewhat similar. And basically you have a matrix that creates the base, and some type of foam that serves as a buoyancy to keep the mat floating on the surface of the water. Some of these may have some type of internal structure that's in the form of, like, say, PVC piping to keep the mat from being too wobbly. But you can see here, essentially, you've got a mat that comes to you pre-cored, so that now you can essentially just plop into that mat say, for instance, like a peat pot, or like even up to a gallon-sized container of a pre-grown plant. The bottom of the mat really is designed to mimic a natural wetland surface. And so you can see a natural base on the left-hand side versus a synthetic base on the right-hand side. And all of that additional surface area is important, because that's where all those microbes start to grow on. And it's through those microbes, along with the plant roots, that you end up with that nutrient extraction. This is the bottom of the matrix after only about 1 month of growth. So you can see already the plant roots are well extended into the water. But in addition to that, discoloration, let's call it, of the mats, that's all a result of different types of organisms that are residing within and on the surface of that matrix. And then, as you can see, these pictures really probably only after about like 2 to 3 months of the plants being in the water, the roots really extend down through the mats very quickly. You get this rapid root penetration. And so it's just the plants, doing their thing to extract the nutrients from the water. One of the big things with floating wetland islands, and probably one of the biggest headaches associated with them, is that because of their mass, they are subject to wind shear, meaning that if there's a lot of exposure, they'll start to blow around and move around. So the way that that is overcome is by anchoring them in place. And based on my experience and my applications of these systems, I mean, you really need to have a pretty astute anchoring system. Typically, you could use a couple of 5-gallon buckets filled up with cement on each corner. It's important to really tether those anchors to the floating wetland island, probably with some type of braided steel cable, so that it's a firm attachment, because that's typically the biggest problem with them, is that they will move around or even break away from their anchors if not properly secured. In terms of what plants, I mean, it's really, you could use just about anything that you can imagine. Typically, my recommendations is to go with more of the common wetland plant species. These would be rushes and sedges. They do very well. They grow very rapidly. But you could also use a variety of flowering plants, including like pickerelweed, blue flag iris. Some of the early installations that I went and inspected back in the late 1990s, people were actually using a variety of annual plants that you would basically plant around your house just to add some color. But typically what we want to be doing is using plants that do well in aquatic environments, and these would be your wetland type species as illustrated on this slide. As I mentioned, not only can you use these floating wetland islands as a means of removing nutrients, but you can actually create habitat. And this particularly, comes into play with a lot of these retention basins, or maybe areas of shoreline, even within the bay itself, where there's been like some type of bulkheading done. What the floating wetland island would do would be to attempt to replicate what was there originally in terms of littoral habitat. So that habitat transition as you go from water to land, which would typically be some type of riparian area or a wetland type area. So you can try to recreate or mimic that type of habitat with the floating wetland islands. The islands will also help decrease the amount of erosion along the shoreline, doing away with what we often see in bulkheaded situations as what's called this echo effect, where waves come in, they bounce off the bulkhead, and then create an erosion impact at a little bit of a distance, maybe 15, 20 feet away from the bulkhead itself. So these are techniques that, different techniques rather, where you can use floating wetland islands and get some additional benefit, either in terms of habitat or some type of mitigation of shoreline erosion problems. Here's just an example. This is not one of my pictures. I just took this off of the web, of floating wetland islands being installed in a typical retention pond. And if you look up at this section of the edge of this retention pond, you can see where it's really eroded. These are basically being installed along the perimeter to duplicate what should be some natural riparian transition as you go from land to water. And then, as I mentioned, the larger mats, this is basically about a 200 square foot mat. This could be kind of floated out into the middle of this natural pond and used to create or replicate fish habitat. Fish will definitely use this as shelter. They'll come underneath these areas to feed on the organisms that are growing on the extended roots, or serve as sort of like refuge habitat for small fish, and then that'll in turn attract the larger game fish. This is an example of a project that we recently completed at Deal Lake about 2 years ago, where floating wetland islands were installed both in Wesley Lake and Sunset Lake under the direction of the Deal Lake Commission. And here we use this as a great opportunity to bring out the public, teach them a little bit about lake ecology and lake restoration, and then also get them engaged in the actual planting of the islands. So there's some ownership there by the community. These are the islands that were installed in Sunset Lake in 2021. So this is right in Asbury Park. This is shortly after installation. One thing that you'll note here is the fencing that is placed along the perimeter of the floating wetland islands. This is to keep ducks and geese off of the island so that they don't damage the plant material or eat the plant material. Unfortunately, this needs to stay up for at least a year while the plants become established. These are the same floating wetland islands pictures that I took this past summer. So this is after about a year of operation. And you can see here that the plant growth is very lush, very dense. No maintenance required of these floating wetland islands. They do well over the winter. They don't need to be removed. They can withstand freezing, and still the plants will come back and grow year after year after year. But you can see, looking at the initial amount of plant growth and a year later, that these plants are doing their job in terms of removing nutrients from the water column. These are some other examples of installations in large natural lakes. These are some installations that were done in water bodies a few years ago, but again, emphasizing the need to protect your investment, meaning the installation of the goose fencing around the perimeter. And if you don't do that, you're not protecting your installation, and you will end up with failure. So typically most failures are a result of not protecting the plants during that primary initial growing phase. And this is why you end up with the plants being trampled or being consumed by geese. Eventually, you will reach a point, maybe after about 4 or 5 years, where it would be advisable to go in and harvest all of that plant material. So now you've got all of that nutrients that's stored up in the plants. You remove that, you take that to a composting facility, and then you start new. And that's typically advisable for most floating wetland islands, so that you can receive a continued, let's call it supercharged removal of nutrients from the water body. But again, this is an example of an island that has been in place for almost 5 years and has withstand multiple years of freezing over the winter without the need for the island to be removed or for the plant material to be replaced. There are some limitations. First off, the cost per pound, both for phosphorus and nitrogen, is relatively high, about $800 a pound. That's about the same cost per pound for the removal of phosphorus and nitrogen using various types of stormwater techniques, particularly, say, for instance, planter boxes or large-scale manufactured treatment devices. The amount of removal definitely is a function of the growing season. So the longer the growing season, the more removal you're going to achieve. And also could be affected by the rate of flow. So the slower the flow, that means more contact time, that means more opportunity for plants to uptake and utilize or assimilate those nutrients. And then definitely certain plants function better than others. For the most part, the sedges and rushes, those typical wetland plants, do really, really well in these types of settings. And therefore, they probably should be used as the workhorse vegetation with floating wetland islands. As I mentioned and illustrated, you definitely need to protect the islands during at least the first year of installation from impacts by waterfowl or maybe other wildlife. After about 4 or 5 years, the plants should be harvested, and there's going to be some replanting costs associated with that. Typically, their effectiveness goes up as the concentration of phosphorus and nitrogen becomes higher and higher in the water column. But that's a good thing because, as I mentioned before, a great application for these would be in the multiple retention basins that you see throughout the Barnegat Bay watershed, or maybe installation in some of the slower moving streams that feed into the bay. If any of you are interested in learning more about some of the plants that would function well for floating wetland islands, you can look at these two publications, Through the Looking Glass or Living Lakes. And both of those focus on plants that do well along nearshore areas, but those same plants will do extremely well in a floating wetland island application. So with that, I thank you and hope you've learned a little bit about floating wetland islands and how they can, really help Barnegat Bay with respect to the removal of nitrogen, phosphorus, as well as sediment.